Hey guys, it's Ty and welcome back to my channel. So today I just kind of wanted to do a discussion video, and in this video we are going to be talking about The Housemaid by Freida McFadden and The Last Mrs. Parrish by Liv Constantine. So if you guys remember, last year I ended up reading The Housemaid and I absolutely loved it. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. I even put it in my top books of 2024. I talked about that book several times on my channel last year. And every time that I talked about it, I believe different people were telling me that I should read The Last Mrs. Parrish by Liv Constantine. And someone even said that The Last Mrs. Parrish is actually the original The Housemaid. Now, in the beginning, I did not know what they meant by that. And so I did a little quick Google search, and there has been speculations that elements from The Housemaid have been used from The Last Mrs. Parrish. And so my interest was piqued. I have recently finished The Last Mrs. Parrish, and I will say that I did find some similarities that could be a little questionable. So in order for me to talk about the similarities and the differences between both of the books, I do have to spoil some things. So this is a disclaimer. This is going to be a spoiler-filled video. I'm only going to spoil the things that I'm going to specifically be talking about. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about things that aren't necessarily important. So if you have not read these books, or you've read one or the other, or vice versa, then if you don't want to be spoiled, I suggest you go and read those books and then come back. Or if you don't care and you just want to stick around and hear my thoughts, feel free to stay. Before I jump into what I found to be similar between both of these books, I'm going to go ahead and give you guys a brief synopsis in case you need like a little refresher. So in The Housemaid by Freida McFadden, we are following this down on her luck girl, Millie. I think she's like in her 20s and she's had some things happen in her past. She's kind of looking to start over and she needs a job. She ends up applying to be the housemaid for this married couple, Nina and Andrew. She ends up getting the job. It pays great and they're giving her a place to stay in their attic. In the beginning, everything seems to go smoothly until she starts to notice that the wife, Nina, is treating her kind of bad. And she notices that something is strange with the attic that she's staying in. Like, she can't lock the door from the inside. It is locked from the outside. In this story, we are following her as she starts to discover some things about Nina and Andrew. So then in The Last Mrs. Parrish by Liv Constantine, we're primarily following Amber. She's also a young woman, like in her 20s, and she befriends this older lady, Daphne. And Amber specifically befriended Daphne because she wants Daphne's husband, Jackson. She is willing to do anything to have that man because he is made of money and she is looking for a come up in her life, but she gets a little bit more than she expected when she is dealing with Daphne and Jackson. I don't think I mentioned this before. I did also give this 5 out of 5 stars. So when I first started reading The Last Mrs. Parrish, I didn't really notice any similarities, to be honest. And then I hit a point in the story and I was like, oh, I see it. So the first thing that I want to mention, what really made me realize that this was very similar to The Housemaid, was just the format, because I really liked the format of The Housemaid, and The Last Mrs. Parrish had the exact same format. And let me just say, because I did not mention this, is that The Last Mrs. Parrish was published in 2017, and then The Housemaid was published in 2022. So do what you will with that information. So in both of these books, the first part 1, is told from the younger women. So in The Housemaid, part 1 is told from Millie's perspective. And then in The Last Mrs. Parrish, part 1 is told by Amber, that young woman. So then in part 2, the story is told from the wives, where we kind of like go back in time and they catch us up to where we are now, and they kind of let us know everything that they've been dealing with in regards to their husbands. And then in part 3, with both of these books, we're getting alternating POVs between the two characters. So that, of course, raised some alarm bells, if you would say. So one of the things that I noticed as I was continuing to read The Last Mrs. Parrish is that the characters are kind of quite similar. So both Millie and Amber from both books, they are young women, young, beautiful women, and they have some secrets from their past that ends up being brought up throughout the story. So then we also have the wives. These wives are like socialites. They don't have to work if they don't want to. Nina from The Housemaid, she has a bratty daughter. And then we have Daphne from The Last Mrs. Parrish. She has two daughters. Her youngest daughter is really bratty, so that's kind of the same. And then their husbands are kind of the same in both of the books. So both of these husbands, they make a lot of money. They're able to support their wives, and they're kind of mean and abusive to their wives in both of these stories. Hence the reason why we have the attic in The Housemaid, because Andrew uses the attic as a way to punish Nina. So anytime she did something that he didn't like, he would like lock her up in the attic. And then we have Jackson, who didn't have an attic in The Last Mrs. Parrish, but he tortured Daphne in other ways. He was mentally abusive, physically abusive. He would threaten to kill her. He tried to control her weight. He pit his daughters against her. He taunted her with things that he knew she didn't like. So he was mean in other ways. The gist of it all is that both of these men were horrible to their wives. Now, I will say the relationship between the wives and the younger women were a little different in both of the books. Nina in The Housemaid was actually trying to do things to push Millie away in the beginning. She was kind of doing things, little things to get her in trouble. Like she would tell her to go pick up her daughter from her school, but would give her the wrong date and time. She would make a mess and then have Millie clean it up. So she was trying to do things to push like Millie's buttons in the hopes that she would leave. Whereas Daphne in The Last Mrs. Parrish was the complete opposite when it came to Amber. Daphne was actually trying to befriend Amber and get in really good with her, even though Amber was kind of like trying to do the same thing with her. But Daphne was trying to be super nice, super sweet, because ultimately these wives were trying to push these younger women to their husbands so that their husbands would leave them so that they could escape. So both of these were actually really the same. They just went about it in kind of different ways. So I want to go ahead and just point out some glaring similarities that I found in both of these stories. So like I have been saying, these wives were trying to push these younger women to their husbands. In both of these books, there were scenes where the husbands wanted to take their wives to some sort of play, Broadway play, but the wives, for whatever reason, could not make it. And so they said, oh, take the young women. And that's what they did in both of these books. In the night of the play, these young women stayed with these husbands, and then things happened. It happened exactly the same in both of these books. That was like one of the scenes, especially in The Last Mrs. Parrish, where I was starting to see where the similarities were in both of these stories. Now, I have mentioned that these wives were not treated the nicest by their husbands, and so they were trying to do anything that they could do to try to get away from them. And so in both of these books, the wives ended up secretly getting IUDs so they cannot get pregnant. Nina was trying to leave her husband. She didn't want to leave with another child. And then Daphne also did not want to have another child with her husband Jackson, because she was trying to leave. So that happened the exact same way in both of these books. There's also a scene where both of these wives were committed to like these psychiatric hospitals. Now, the situations in which they came to those hospitals are a little bit different, but it's the fact that both of them went to a psychiatric hospital. So in The Maid, Nina was accused of trying to drown her daughter, and the husband called the cops on her, and they said that, you know, she was having some sort of breakdown. So that's why she went to the psychiatric hospital. Now in The Last Mrs. Parrish, Daphne was actually trying to take her girls and run from her husband. He didn't like that, and he ended up calling the cops on her and provided like this false information that she was going through like depression, and then she ended up going to some psychiatric institution. So in both books, the situations were slightly different, but the outcomes were exactly the same. Weird. And then I think I slightly mentioned this in the beginning, was that with both of our younger women, with Millie and Amber, they both had some sketchy past. And of course, there were scenes in both books where the wives then confronted them about their sketchy past. They were like the same but slightly different. And they used that to confront these women, to try to use it against them, to prevent them from, like, I guess, not wanting to be with their husbands. But again, it's like the same situation. So those were some of the similarities, like the big similarities that I saw within each of these books. And then of course, there were a lot of differences between the stories. Some I kind of mentioned, like Nina in The Housemaid was trying to like push Millie away, whereas Daphne was trying to be her friend and like bring her in and like make her feel comfortable. And then how Andrew was locking Nina up in the attic, he did the same thing with Millie. And then we also had Jackson just taunting his wife in different ways. But one of the big things that I didn't mention that was similar was that both of these husbands, they did end up leaving their wives. So Andrew in The Housemaid, he ended up kicking Nina out. And then Jackson in The Last Mrs. Parrish, he told Daphne that he wanted a divorce, and she gladly gave it to him. Now, these books did end differently. I think towards the end, The Housemaid had a lot of action, especially with that attic. Like, that's what the story kind of revolved around, was the events that took place in this attic. And ultimately, the husband, Andrew, in The Housemaid, ended up being killed by Millie in that attic after she tortured him for a couple of days. And Nina let her get away and took the fall. And then in The Last Mrs. Parrish, Jackson did end up marrying Amber, and Daphne revealed to him like Amber's past. But after she did that, she helped get Jackson sent away to prison for money laundering. And so even though Amber ended up with a man, she still doesn't have a man because he's going to jail. So both of these stories ended up in different places. But I mean, I will say there were quite a few big similarities between the two. Make of that what you will. I really enjoyed both of these stories because I think there were enough differences to make the two stories different enough for me. So that's actually all that I have. I'm sure that I might have missed some details here or there when trying to compare and contrast the two. So if there is anything that you caught that I didn't, please feel free to leave that down in the comments below. And also let me know if you liked both of these books or if you liked one over the other. I'm really curious to know that as well. But I will see you guys next time. Bye.